we hear this phrase, long march through the institutions.
Yeah.
How do you feel that has worked with the BBC, this idea actually that institutions have been effectively captured? Do you think the BBC had a long march?
Yes, I do. And I think that the answer to your question is that it's what I call cultural Marxism. Yeah. So I think what the progressive left in the UK has taken from Marxism is the idea that history is a one-way ticket and there's no getting off the train, that the end destination is a progressive destination, their definition of progress, by the way, and that this is an ineluctable process. So there's no stopping it. And so we will, in this mindset, we will arrive at some point in a federal Europe. We will arrive in a country which is completely atheistic, and a country which has lost all sense of natural patriotic pride in itself. All that is to be subsumed in a greater self. And that's the sort of, that's what I mean by cultural Marxism. The idea that that is a destination which is certain to arrive at some point. I think it's nonsense, actually. I don't believe in the Marxist interpretation of history. I don't think that, and I think that any rational observer of history of the past 200 years can see that there have been sudden jolts, sudden turnings in the road, and that's the way history it is. It doesn't go in a straight line to a predestination.
Yeah.
And I sense, I mean, the one thing that I feel is quite hopeful at the moment in Britain, and of course Brexit is the actualization of it in some ways, is that was the first time in my lifetime that the voters, actually said, no, that's not what we want. They were given the opportunity and they said, no, this is stopping right here. That's why there's been that's why it's so painful for the BBC.
Yes.
It's so painful for the cultural left. There's, Brexit is something which wounds them deeply because it offends their sense that actually, maybe we're not going to get to that destination, which was something they always took for granted.
Basically, this is something that particularly entrepreneurs, smaller business, whatever, this is a message that they must definitely try and disseminate, isn't it? Because, I mean, essentially people aren't that clear. They are open at the moment to being frightened. I think this is the problem, don't you think? I mean, you go and see people in their living rooms, as it were, don't you? I'm sorry, that sounds terrible.
That sounds really
but you actually go, don't you, to a very local level?
Yeah.
And you talk to all sorts of different people.
Absolutely.
And basically, presumably, this must come up a lot to you. I mean, when people come.
I mean, so what we do is that we do meetups, and they're quite casual, very informal. And we work on a level, city level, but also on a town level.
Right.
I go along to pub meetups, hear what people have got to say, but really it is a social event. But a lot of the times I ask them, has Project Fear got to you? The majority of them say no, but a few people go, actually, I could be slightly scared of X, Y, Z. And then if you look into it, you sort of start picking out things that they're scared of and giving them alternative information, and they start coming around to the idea that actually it's not such a bad idea coming out on WTO terms. You do hear a lot of things around and about of this fear mongering, and they've got to the stage where they no longer listen to it because they just see it as a partisan attempt to scare them into submission when it comes to a second referendum. They want people to be scared so they can funnel them into the idea of a second referendum. And we have to make sure that funnel goes to a WTO no deal terms, because that's, for me, I think that's what we voted for in the first place,
yes,
and that's what should be delivered to the British people.
And Peter, on that, just very quickly, I mean, one of the things the Remain campaign have done brilliantly well since the referendum is they looked at how the Leave campaign used language. So they were Remain. It's sort of a bit... Brexit is swashbuckling, global, and they looked at that and they thought, this is effective. So they've developed this language and they're pumping it out, no deal. Well, what does no deal actually mean? No deal means no comprehensive free trade agreement. It does not mean no deal on medicines. It does not mean people can't still partake in the Eurovision Song Contest or, Erasmus or Horizon.
Or Strictly Come Dancing. Yes.
Come Dancing,
Yeah,
European edition.
Yes, yes.
And they've done that very well. No deal does not mean completely severing all links, putting up a big wall with machine gun posts on it and saying we're not dealing with you anymore.
But there was request like, please, mimsy. No.
Yes.
Mimsy can't be. Yeah,
yes, can you tell us about that? There's a particular picture that caused problems for you, didn't it? I mean, we'll have it up on screen actually, but can you tell us what actually happened there? And we'll explain it to what's in the picture there.
Right, so Mimsy, she's an artist, a British artist working at the pseudonym, and she was invited by us as a guest artist in 2015 to show the series of her light boxes called Isis in Sylvania at the Mall Gallery in London. And at that time, we've just survived the terror attack in Copenhagen. It was just before the attacks in Paris in September. So we were in touch with the British police in relation to security. Being aware that so many people come in one place, people that care about freedom, writers, journalists, thinkers, guests from abroad. And the police said that they will see what they can do. It might not be necessary. They will keep an eye on that. But then the closer it was getting to the exhibition, we could see certain things happening. So our newsletter, in which we included Mimsy's work, dropped it. The image was dropped without even discussing it with us. Then we received an email that the British police contacted the gallery and told them that this artwork is potentially inflammatory. And they would advise not to show this artwork. But then if we chose to show this artwork, we need to pay £6,000 a day for the police protection. When we said, we will find the money, we will pay. It's art.
It's a freedom.
It's freedom. We are in London. We are in the heart of democracy.
And the list started to be longer. It was not only this art. So once they recognize that we are really quite dangerous for them as one who really protect freedom, they prolonged the list for another wife of journalist that she should not show up. I said, but she's already in the country. No, so there is no way that she can make any speech because she is also dangerous. And also another artworks, it's also dangerous. And then the list become longer, and then we feel it. They already started.
But what was interesting about this particular piece, the Mimsy piece, is that this was ISIS, right? And they're talking about that possibly being inflammatory, to actually have ISIS in this particular context.
Well, what I found quite amusing, and obviously the viewers will see the artwork, what I found amusing is that if anything, we are being the offended ones, not the ISIS, because they come with the guns, they are ready to kill us, and we're just having a beer or a picnic, just idling away. So
it's obviously because this picture shows the sense of humor. We're not afraid of them. We laugh at them. That's why, because to show them in the situation when they're dangerous, when they get the power on us, when they cut the head, this is all right. But when we make a fun of them,
yes, because they were mice and hamsters. They were not the lions of Islam. They were mice and hamsters. That's quite upsetting. I bet they had some little tantrums.
Well, that you say this, because it was always my sense that in the Brexit campaign, for example, this constant emphasis on the left behind was not necessarily getting to the nub of it. Because in fact these things were a cultural anxiety, cultural feeling very much. One thing that you said that I really want to pick up, you're talking about basically a white majority being open, as it were, absorbing new people. Is that possible, surely, when you have the rate of migration, which is historically unprecedented, that we have, for example, in Europe at the moment? And I'm sure maybe in America, I don't know, but in Europe, surely it means that things have got to be steadier, doesn't it? Doesn't it mean that it's got to be, well, what would you say? I mean, it seems to me that it's making it almost impossible for that to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the speed of immigration will affect it. It'll simply allow for larger minority groups, they'll reach critical mass, which may allow them to not mix as much, although I think the evidence is sketchier on that. What I would say is there probably will be mixing in any event, but I think that it's just that the majority group will grow smaller.
Right.
Its consciousness and its myths, symbols, memories, whatever, will become a smaller part of the picture, of the total picture. Because there's two entities here. There is the ethnic majority, but there's also the nation as a whole.
Yeah.
And there's something I call ethno-traditional nationalism, which is a bit of a big word, but people are also attached to the nation as a whole, which it's not just about sort of British values or something like that, but also there is a majority and a minority culture which inform the nation as a whole. So even an ethnic minority, even a British Pakistani, and we know this from some survey data, they can, particularly the Conservatives, will be attached to the idea of Britain having a white British group that is sizable.
Right.
That a Britain in which it's just a collection of minorities is not necessarily something even these minorities want, because they're attached to a traditional conception of what the nation is. And of course, white British people are even more attached to that on average. So it's also an attachment to the ethnic composition, which doesn't mean that people want it to be homogenous and everybody, if you're not white, you're not a member of the nation. No, but it's more that, you know, there's a majority and there are minorities, and that's fine, but we don't want to necessarily have over rapid change to that matrix.
You've actually got with you a GCSE history book. I wonder if you could show us a bit.
Yeah.
This is. Can you explain why you've got that?
Yes, well, this is a GCS history book. It's mainstream. It's what lots of children will be seeing when they learn history at GCSE, and it has a section on the on Russia and the collectivization of farms under Stalin. It has, you know, the results of collectivization, and you see there it says there were pros and cons of collectivization.
Amazing.
Pros and cons.
Yeah.
Now this is a process in which millions of people died. We've got quite reliable estimates now for Ukraine, in which 3.9 million people died. This is comparable to the Holocaust.
Yes.
And this book, seen by hundreds of thousands of children in British schools, is telling them there were pros and cons. Would they really say there were pros and cons of the Holocaust? I don't think so. I think it is obscene and wrong. And one of the things I would like to do in my project is to challenge some of the things that our children are being taught, and indeed some of the things that our children are not being taught. At no point does this try to define how many millions died. It keeps off that subject.
With this piece that you've just written, you are actually sort of looking at the communist credentials, aren't you, of the people around Corbyn? Because he's sort of portrayed very much, obviously, as a bit of a bogeyman by the right-wing press, but at the same time as, if you like, just a lefty. There's a difference, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, there is a big difference. There are all sorts of variations on the socialist spectrum, from Tony Blair, who many true socialists would believe never was a socialist, right the way through to members of the Communist Party of Britain and various other fringe groups, of which there have been many over the last 100 years, and there are still many kicking around. Most of them are now on board as Corbyn supporters. The thing that attracted me most of all to it in the beginning, or attracted my attention rather, is that I realised there were a lot of individuals that I had known of as extreme left-wingers who were now gathered around the Corbyn circle. And it struck me that nobody who understood what they believed and what they were standing for would actually draw them into an inner circle of advisors and associates unless they really were either neutral or sympathetic with what those particular individuals had been pursuing as a political doctrine for 10, 20, 30, in some cases 40 years.
And it's assumed, isn't it, that you won't be Conservative, isn't that right?
Yeah, it's assumed that I'd be Labour, that I'd support Jeremy Corbyn, that I'd support socialism, all of this stuff. And I quite simply don't think the socialism works. I mean, we've seen it in so many countries, and it's an economic system that's failed. I mean, there's a lot of pro-black people that support socialism because of leaders like Malcolm X, for example, and some leaders in parts of Africa after decolonisation that did advocate socialist economics, and it just doesn't work. And I ask myself, how can I support something that I just don't believe in.
Yeah.
Why do you expect me to support something that I don't believe in just because of my skin colour?
What is your reaction when you hear the phrase traditional masculinity is harmful?
I find it extremely offensive and poisonous. I'm the son of a coal miner. I'm the first boy in my family that ever made it to university. I escaped a destiny of sort of servitude, if you like. My dad spent sort of 16 hours a day underground digging coal, and I thought that was what my life was going to be. And I was encouraged through male role models at school, teachers who had a belief in me, a father who had a belief in me despite the fact he was dyslexic and had been abandoned by the education system, like many boys today. And I decided to strive forward, and that was a traditional patriarch, my male role model, doing that. Now, where's the bad in that? So I just think that the war on the concept of masculinity by the media, by academia, and by the wider political establishment is a gross dereliction of duty, which does men no favours. You mentioned very serious issues at the beginning, issues sadly such as male suicide, and the fact that boys are the bottom of education stack from reception to university, and at the very bottom of that are white working class lads. People like myself, of a generation before, and yet there is very little political will to help them.
I was born with a weird defect, probably lots of weird defects. One of them is I was always convinced that if I was lying, people could see into my head and know I was lying. Okay, right. And so therefore, right. I've always found it so much easier to. I mean, look, if I have an affair, I probably won't be blurting it out in say Scarlett Johansson decides that she wants to shag me, which she well might, I don't know. I mean, she might be attracted by my mind. I'm not going to tell the wife, and I'm not going to reveal it in print. But generally, my policy is tell the truth. It's about brand integrity. And you look at the best politicians in the world right now. They're the ones. People are always accusing Trump of being a liar. Actually, I think he tells it like it is pretty often. Look at Boris Johnson. Look at my hero, the Jacob. The Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't wriggle. He tells it like it is.
I think it's interesting because we've got used to that situation now. Because even Thatcher, even her, the enemies that hated her, viscerally hated her, never could actually say she was a dissembler, could they? They could never say she was a liar.
You look at some of her interviews on YouTube, and it's almost like watching porn if you're a right-wing person. You just think, oh my God, she really was as good as I remember. In fact, she was better. She really was better. Yeah. When she gets a lefty interviewer trying to kind of trap her on the uncaringness of conservatism, and she's got an answer. She believes in conservatism.
I think that we've reached peak wank, if I can put it like that. And I think the subject which the issue which I think it's beginning to turn on is transgenderism. Right. Yeah. Now it's a good one because there are, as Julie Burchill once put it, these screaming memes and bedwetters. That's right. Shrieking about things and shrieking for the right to be thought of that their current gender is as authentic as the one they were assigned to at birth. No, it isn't. You are not women. That's what science says. And fortunately, on that issue, you have a coalition which says this is bollocks. You have Peter Tatchell. You have the radical feminists, the TERFs as they're now called. And you have people who have never gone along with this shrieking victimhood of any of the intersectional.
Julie Burchill, not Julie. Julie Bindel is another one, isn't she?
Julie Bindell's another one. I mean, Germaine Greer.
They're sort of eating their own, as it were, aren't they?
They are. But I think that is one of the subjects where, because the government swallowed it whole. The government goes along with it all. So do the universities, so does the BBC, etc. But people don't. And more often, I'm beginning to hear the other side of the argument being put in a way which doesn't happen, for example, on immigration and various other subjects. Yeah. That suddenly people are saying, well, actually, this might mean an end to women's sport.
Yes,
completely.
exactly.
You know, this might... Actually, what is going on at the bloody Tavistock Clinic? What the hell?
Arguing basically that against the tide, isn't that right, of what museums particularly were doing, in the sense that you're saying that we shouldn't feel worried about where the various items have come from. Is that right?
I wanted to take a position, which is artefacts on the whole should remain where they are, not fixed in stone, but they shouldn't be returned to their origins automatically, which is the kind of the contemporary feeling, if you like. But I also wanted to take a step back and say why. It's very easy in these debates to become really entrenched and to take a position and then just rant at each other. You don't persuade anybody. So I wanted to look at why it had come to be the case that in the last 30 years, museums, which are, they've always been a little bit political, but they have become intensely politicized, and they become like the place where people are advocating for social change. The repatriation of artifacts should go back because of the sins of colonization and because of what it can do for communities today. And I wanted to ask, why museums? Why not Parliament? Why not the public square? Why museums? What was it about them?
What was the effect of your book? I mean, has there been any kind of change at all? I mean, I know it's hard really to measure, but do you think it's affected the way they think about these things?
I think for a small time it opened up a space of conversation, and I think that's really important. So I don't know if I changed anybody's mind who was who was a repatriation advocate, if you like, but I wanted to say, this is why I think what I think, this is where my thinking came from, and just to kind of unpick things and unlock things. And I think that's something we really need today, particularly in culture, where it's just become it's become a war.
Yeah.
And I just, let's get off the battleground and get around a table and talk to each other about why we think what we think.
I think that there is BBC, Parliament, or as you said, civil service, all of our institutions. The breakdown of trust, I think, now is palpable. This is going to have massive repercussions for our culture coming on, isn't it?
It is, but you know what? I actually think that that's part of the benefit of this whole process.
Yes, indeed.
My glass is always half full; it's never half empty. And I think that more and more people are just realising how badly governed we are by politicians and by civil servants. And this old adage that we've got the best civil service in the world is pure and utter nonsense. Frankly, from what I've seen and learnt, they don't work that hard. They can't be trusted to deliver what politicians are instructing them. And actually, very often, they're not that competent. And so there needs to be a proper reassessment of the way that departments are led. I would much favour, for example, rather like they have in the American executive, where a new Secretary of State coming into a department could bring in 12, 15 people from the private sector to take the helm of that department and frankly shake it up, be there for 3 or 4 years and then move on. And I think we need to build in a culture amongst the private sector where you need to do a stint working within government as part of your CV as you go forward. If we build in that, at the moment you've got twin tracks. You're either in the civil service for life or you're basically in the private sector for life. There's very, very little crossover. And actually, that is not serving our country well. And I think that's one of the big debates when we get through this.
All of this stuff about how guilty the West feels. The people who promote Western guilt, they don't feel personally guilty. They don't feel guilty. Yeah. They feel smug.
Yes.
Because they know all the evils that the West has been guilty of, and that makes them superior. I often find these big public apologies that Western leaders have sometimes made for slavery, or it's just, they don't feel sorry. Yeah. They didn't do anything, and they know they didn't do anything. And these people who claim to feel guilty know they didn't do anything. They didn't enslave anybody personally. They're not responsible for slavery. They didn't kill any Indians. It's fake. It's emotionally fake. And that's, I mean, as a person and as a novelist, I have to say, I have a real sensitivity to emotional falsity.
Yeah.
And that's what really puts me off about the hard left. They're fake. And all the emotions they claim for themselves are stand-ins for something else. You could actually put together a little set of equations.
But what, this you just put forward what you believe. The fact is, being called right-wing now
is an insult.
Is a sort of insult. Even your average Tory, I think, would consider it an insult now, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
If you go back to, say, like 1979, when you went to school, or throughout the 80s, was it the case then, do you think, or has this got worse in your lifetime?
I think there's always been a little bit from the left and the right, where the left, the right may be competent and get the job done, but the left are good people and they mean well. Yeah. And there's always been this thing, but it's got worse and worse and worse now, that we're the good people on the left, you're the baddies. Yeah. That's the whole, this whole trope about, never kissed a Tory and things like that, which I think is really, really weird. And you just don't see the same level of vitriol from the mainstream right. They'll immediately point to, say, Tommy Robinson and talk about the far right. These people aren't in the mainstream political arena. Yeah. But in terms of attitudes towards people and debating people on the basis of, look, we both want the country to be a good place. We want people to have productive, happy lives and make choices for themselves, and children to get good education, people to get good health, get all these, the trains to run. Now, it's no longer a debate about what's the best way of doing this? Yeah. How would we best go about getting the outcome we want? Now, Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems will all come with different perspectives on that. But the argument between left and right now is, we're good people on the left. Yeah. We want the right things. Whatever you want, even if it works, you wanted it for the wrong reasons. Yeah. And this idea that your motivations are somehow evil if you're considered to be right-wing is a very new and I think very disturbing development.
You see, you peppered your sentences there with, we want this to work well with the country and we all want this. But that sort of presupposes you feel that there's a country and that you're part of it. Isn't this the crucial thing?
Yeah.
I mean, you would call yourself a somewhere, would you, as opposed to an anywhere? This David Goodhart thing?
This whole citizen of the world nonsense.
What is that?
I genuinely find that utterly bizarre. Yeah. It is totally normal and natural and desirable that we should care more about what happens to our immediate families and then our immediate neighbours, our colleagues, our friends, people we know through school or something, and workplace. And you widen this out to people from your local area. Oh, did you hear about that terrible crime? It's a lady down my street that it happened to. Oh, that man, do you know what happened to him? He's from my hometown. We feel this affinity with people because we have a connection to them. And the idea that I shouldn't care more about what happens to people who live in my own country more than people who live in another country, I find quite bizarre. So much about what is considered to be right-wing now is patriotism, a belief in the nation state, a belief that we have an affinity with each other, a culture, not just a past but a future with each other. And this is somehow dirty and nasty and evil and wrong. And I think the vast majority of people in this country look at those debates and just think, frankly, the political and media class have gone stock staring mad.
I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about this without giving away too much of your lecture, but this is a fascinating subject you're talking on, which is essentially Britain's other Brexit, its first Brexit.
That's one of the subjects. I do several.
Yes.
I have lots of things up my sleeve, including one that I think is in some ways even more apposite to our present catastrophe than that, which is on why Churchill was great. And what I argue is Churchill is great because of writing a very important history book.
Really?
Writing on his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. And what he does, he looks at the relationship between, again, it's very much this question of the relationship between England, Britain and Europe.
Yes.
And he looks at the relationship between England, Britain, because Britain is just a formal political entity at this point from 1707, and the France of Louis XIV. And what he does, he looks at Louis XIV and he's not quite sure what the modern analogy is. Yeah. He's writing this after the rise of Stalin, but before the rise of Hitler.
Yes,
it's in this middle period. And what he's doing in that is saying, I know why Louis XIV is wicked. On the one hand, he is aiming for external hegemony. dominance of Europe. On the other hand, he's an internal persecutor, the persecution of the Huguenots. And he sees this, the relation of internal persecution and the external pursuit of hegemony, as the authentic mark of totalitarian tyranny. Now you can see, it's like Pirandello, 6 characters in search of an author. He's looking for a modern analogy.
Yes.
And this is why he understood Hitler in a way which nobody else did, and as quickly as he did, because he'd already worked out the lineaments. So it's a jolly good lecture. The other Brexit, well, of course it's a good lecture. The other one is when the boot is on the other foot and we're dealing with a quasi, but it's very quasi-totalitarian ruler in Britain, which is Henry VIII, and the lecture you heard is Henry VIII and the first Brexit. And what I argue there, of course, is that the break with the Roman Church is absolutely analogous to our separating ourselves from the EU. It's even fought over the same territory.
Yes.
It's fought over jurisdiction.
Yes.
I mean, why does Henry have to break with Rome to get his divorce? Because England is subordinate to a European court.
Yes.
What is the other ground of the conflict? The amount of money you pay.
Yes,
quite extraordinary, and it goes into absolute detail. The way Henry does it is by the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty. In other words, the idea, which is being pursued hotly by the Legion of Remainers headed by Centurion Burko, is that parliamentary sovereignty can be used to deny national sovereignty.
Yes,
it's an absurd contradiction. Parliamentary sovereignty only makes sense within the notion of a sovereign independent state. Otherwise, it's meaningless verbiage. And again, of course, it highlights the fact that the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty long predates democracy, and that the great crisis in Britain is that we've never worked out what the relationship between an idea of popular sovereignty and parliamentary sovereignty is, which was, of course, exposed with brutal effectiveness by the Brexit referendum.
Interesting thing about the woke thing, though, a bit like PC, it was once said about PC, is that everyone laughs at it and says, oh God, political correctness, but they all abide by it.
Yes.
And I this is my fear as well about the whole woke thing, is that somehow or other, even though people sort of feel uneasy about it and all the rest of it, it's like, it seems to have such a strange power over people that they actually don't want to put a foot wrong, wouldn't you say?
I think that's a really good point, and that's a really important point about wokeness and about political correctness before it. There's all this obsession over political correctness gone mad, which is not a phrase I've ever used, as it happens, and it is a bit of a Daily Mail phrase. But what that kind of phraseology allowed was, it allowed people to think that there was this extreme thing called political correctness, which was kind of out there on the loony left and so on. And in real society, things were still pretty normal. But in fact, what was happening is that throughout that whole period, politically correct thinking was being mainstreamed more and more. And people obsessed over the crazy examples like children being forbidden from singing Bar Bar Black Sheep, or Christmas being renamed, or whatever else it might be. These kind of extreme examples, people obsessed over those, while losing sight of the fact that the fundamentals of political correctness, which is that there is a correct way to speak. If you don't speak in the correct way, you will be punished. There's a correct way to think. Race is the most important thing in society, and you must think racially all the time. All those kind of central features of political correctness through that period were becoming mainstream. And what you've ended up now, most woke people tend to be relatively young. You end up with a new generation who have been completely socialized and educated in the PC way of thinking. And so when I speak on campuses or when I speak to young audiences, I'm always really shocked and depressed by how authoritarian they are, how entitled they seem, and they have this sense that they are absolutely right about everything, and anyone who disagrees with them must be silenced. They have this incredibly strange intolerance of the existence of alternative points of view, and they don't realise quite how unusual that is in human history.
I think American comedy has become much better than British comedy because they're not afraid to talk about whatever they want to talk about.
Yeah.
People in this country are very afraid to talk about a number of things.
It's freer still, do you think, in America then?
Yeah, they've got the First Amendment, freedom of speech, Speech isn't anywhere near as free in this country as people like to think it is. You start saying the wrong things, the price for telling the wrong joke is the police knocking your door. Hello, Mr. Williams. I'd like to talk about a joke you told last night. That's real. And other comedians tell me, I've lost it, oh, you're making it up. It's like, no, you can go and... Everyone knows this. This is an observable fact. Like there's a poster that terrified me. It's by Her Majesty's government. It said, it's not offensive, it's an offence. That's the whole advert. It's on black on white. It's not offensive, it's an offence. It's like, I'm a comedian. You're telling me if I offend someone, I might go to prison? It's almost impossible for me to work here, isn't it? Under those circumstances. Bearing in mind that anyone can take offence to anything.
But it means, surely, doesn't it, that your audience as well is going to be thinking, can I laugh at this? Should I laugh at this?
But I don't mind that. I see a lot of... I disagree with a lot of comedians when they say things like, oh, I should be allowed to offend people and I'm going to offend people, and it's like... I don't think we should be all walking on eggshells.
No.
But in front of you is eggs. In front of you is an audience of people that don't want to be offended, so you can't just get your tennis racket shoes on and start stomping over everyone and think, well, I'm allowed to. Sure, you're allowed to, but these people want to enjoy themselves. It's Saturday night. It's your job to entertain them. So I try and, not offend people if I possibly can. I think it's possible. You can still make a lot of people laugh. Like that Brexit bit won't offend anyone. I've not had anyone who's like, I'm offended. Even if you completely disagree with it, you can still have a laugh at it, hopefully.
You said the subtitle is the system of diversity. So what is this system? I mean, that tends to imply a kind of practical, a very practical system.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting question. I think I call it like a system of relations. So you can say, like in a call and response sort of situation, say the liberal left, someone who's of a liberal left disposition will make a call, and then you can get a predictable response. Say if you're on Twitter, and recently we've had John Cleese getting into trouble with him talking about London not feeling very English anymore. If you say that's racist, immediately you'll get a positive response from the rest of the gang. So in terms of that's how I see it in terms of being systemic in a way that it's predictable, but also that there are relations not just between, say, people on the liberal left side of politics, but then to like the representatives of the favoured identity groups. And there's also, I would say, like a call and response that goes on between those two groups. And it makes it kind of systemic in character. And sorry if I'm waffling with this.
No,
but it kind of makes it systemic in character because those representatives tend to act in a certain way. In order for those relations to work in a predictable fashion, they have to represent their groups as being victims, almost universal victims of society and of the unfavoured groups of the system. And if they do that, then just everything sort of fits in. They can claim maximum victimhood, and the liberal left, who is overseeing and supporting them, has a justification for doing that.
I think where you might be at a good time for this is that students maybe are less likely. We all hear about party allegiances gradually weakening. They're more likely to go to a not explicitly partisan movement at university, something like the Freedom Association or whatever.
I think you're absolutely right there, and I often sort of joke when I'm there, said that the F word is a much easier sell to students than the C word. I'm thinking freedom and conservatism, of course. No. It is. And actually, it's a softer word than. There are other people on our, again, probably the same side of us, who push the libertarian thing. But I think the minute you say libertarian, a lot of people who aren't really political geeks switch off. Whereas freedom, yes, it's more woolly, but people can understand it a bit better.
What do you think? Would she despair, do you think, if she were around now?
I think she'd be furious, just as I think grassroots members are furious. I left the Conservative Party briefly when David Cameron came back with his deal from Brussels when he said he'd renegotiated our relationship with Britain in a fundamental ways. And for me, it was only a cosmetic. And I know you agree with that. And I resigned at that point because I was so angry at the insult to intelligence. It was my protest. And then when Theresa May became leader and said Brexit means Brexit and all those, and said she was going to implement the referendum result, I rejoined. I'm still not to this day sure which is the worst decision, leaving or rejoining. But it was the most important vote of British post-war history, in my view, the decision to leave the European Union, and the fact that the Conservative Party has messed it up. Theresa May definitely is an awful Prime Minister, but the Cabinet sat round that table, acquiescing in most of the bad decisions that she made, and there was a contest for how many bad decisions she made. She appointed a Chancellor who is a do-nothing Chancellor at a time when lots of people voted to leave the European Union, but also a fundamental reset of public policy. The Conservative Party has done very little. She promised to tackle the injustice of her time when she stood on the steps of Downing Street on her first day in the office. She hasn't done anything like, really begun to do it. And Mrs. Thatcher was not, I think, the politician that some people remember. She left the NHS untouched, she left much of the welfare state untouched. She was quite pragmatic. But the things that she said she would do, like tame the unions, like control inflation, like station nuclear weapons in Britain so that we would deter the Soviet Union, she did. You know, nobody really thought Mrs. Thatcher spun and deviated. They knew she was a conviction politician. And I think she'd be appalled, really, that the Conservative Party has been so weak in delivery over the last 3 years.
I mean, when I first saw it, on Twitter, you had me fooled, actually, I have to say. Because, I mean, I've come across quite a lot of people, argue with people with those views. I mean, I wondered, in your case, did you know many Titanias?
Yeah, loads. It's funny you say that, though, because a lot of the critics of it, the people who don't like it, will say, well, it's nothing like real life. This is a straw man, that you're satirising someone that doesn't exist. I'm afraid that's not true. And that's very much wishful thinking on their part. But she's certainly at the extreme end. Like, she's certainly saying the things that most people wouldn't say. But the whole woke movement is a minority. It's a very vocal, powerful minority. That's why it deserves to be satirised.
Yes, exactly. With this point, I think you've made this point before that, it's a question of punching up, isn't it? These people, give us a bit of an idea of her profile. I mean, she's an upper middle class girl, isn't she, right? So basically she's privileged.
Yes.
And yet thinks of herself as a victim.
Yeah.
That's right, isn't it?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. And we all know who I'm talking about. We all know those kinds of people. It's so recognisable. A lot of them are in the media or on Twitter, of course, very vocal on Twitter. I got into an argument. Someone got very angry with me, a columnist from The Guardian, surprise, surprise. And she sent a message saying, well, you're talking about people that don't exist. I've worked at The Guardian. There's no wealthy feminists who constantly go on about being victims. And I said, no, there really are. And if you work at The Guardian, you probably should know. In fact, I suspect she's one of them. And then she came back to me saying, no, unless you name who they are. And I didn't want to name who I was talking about because I deliberately didn't want to make it personal. But she kept pushing, and so I said, okay, there's this person, this person, this person, this person. I listed them. And then she said, well, thank you for that list of the women you hate. You're clearly a misogynist. And that, in of itself, is exactly why I created Titania. That kind of response. I have no argument left. I'm just going to call you a misogynist. That's all I've got. All I've got is the ad hominem attacks, which is funny to me. That's funny to me. That was hilarious. That was, she couldn't have proved my point better. And I think, because I used to teach critical thinking, and I think we have to get back. That people don't understand that as soon as you throw an insult, you've lost. That's it. Game over. Your argument's gone. And I just wish we could get back to that. But Titania is that sort. So Titania will call anyone who disagrees with her a misogynist, fascist often, Nazi, racist, anything, just anything, because she knows that those epithets will stick.
What does it say about the general state of conservatism?
Very good question. I've always been worried about the general state of conservatism because as an intellectual, I think it ought to have proper philosophical foundations, and I look for those foundations and I don't really see them very clearly in practical politics. Of course, in the tradition, in the history, yes, you have Burke and and Hegel and de Maistre and all those people in the Romantic period and what followed in the 19th century, all that is very inspiring, but I don't think it has much impact on the Conservative Party. I mean, the Conservative Party has always been suspicious of intellectuals anyway, on the perfectly good ground that intellectuals think, and thinking is dangerous. You know, you might come up with the wrong idea. So the Conservative Party has always been very, demure about it.
Yeah.
But now I think it's that lack of a proper thought through basis to their worldview is beginning to show, because that's precisely what was needed in the whole Brexit thing, a sense of what and who and where we are as a nation in this confrontation with the global forces which we can't avoid. Where do we put our flag, so to speak, in what territory and how? How do we respond to all the changes brought about by mass migration, and of course especially migration from Eastern Europe? Anybody in his senses in Poland has his eye on coming here. Although I'm glad to say that the Polish economy is picking up, and there's a big beginnings of a movement the other way. But all these things we know are hugely difficult, and it's certainly a case where having some conception of what our country is and where its values and its future come from was necessary.
You mentioned earlier British history, but how else do you sort of instill a feeling of community and national community in your schools? I mean, how...
Well, we sing.
You sing? What do you sing?
I vow to thee, my country. I was singing it this morning. God Save the Queen, Jerusalem. We also talk about these things. You know, we do assemblies. During the World Cup, we had England flags everywhere. It was all about go England, go England. This is particularly important for ethnic minorities who can often feel, well, am I British? Well, what am I really? It's so important, because if you don't feel like you belong in your country, you can never succeed, okay? You have to feel that. Now, some of these kids may grow up and become revolutionaries. Well, great. I mean, that's fine. I've done my job as a teacher. It's my duty.
Yes.
It's my duty to help socialize them. I always talk about the family of Michaela. You've got your own nuclear family, then you've got your larger community, you've got your school family, and then we've got the larger family of the country. And we should all feel like we are together, especially in a multicultural community. It's all the more important, because that's the thing that we share together. Otherwise, we end up splitting, right? And then there's all this discord. If we are to get on together, we have to share something. And the one thing we share is being British. And isn't that a wonderful thing? In some countries, you get murdered if you're gay. The police will murder you in some countries. In some countries, if you're a woman, you can't drive a car, whatever. The point is that we live in a wonderful country, and this is something that we should be celebrating. Doesn't mean it doesn't have its problems. I'm the #1 person to say that the education system in Britain has its problems, right? But that doesn't mean I don't love it as my country, right? And so should the children. And we should all be grateful for this. But too often we don't recognize that, and we don't want to celebrate that. And that's really sad. I often joke about how it's the end of the West, and that's because we've lost something. You talk about Scruton saying post-truth. A lot of people, I think, know this in their heart of hearts. They know. You know how many times, like, I tweet loads, and then I go to an event, and I get so many people, teachers, who come up to me and whisper to me, and they say, I really like what you're saying on Twitter. But they would never say it out loud because they're terrified.
Yes.
And this is crazy. We can't have a situation where people can't say what they believe, what they think, and let's have a conversation. But that's because too many people want to shut the conversation down, and they say, no, you're not allowed to speak. I have people on Twitter getting angry with me because I'm having conversations with people on Twitter who I disagree with, and they say, you shouldn't speak to them. I say, well, what do you mean? I disagree with them, so I want to talk to them.
Yes, exactly.
And have a conversation. They're saying no. There's something wrong with our thinking if we just want to shut certain people out of the conversation.
I actually named them. I mean, I used the anecdote twice. I used it in The British Dream, but the civil servant in particular was still, I think, head of the civil service at the time, so I didn't actually name him. I did name them both in The Road to Somewhere. It was Gus O'Donnell. Gus O'Donnell. I was sitting next to Gus O'Donnell at a dinner at Nuffield College, and he I said I was writing a book about immigration, and he said, "Oh, when I was at the Treasury, I was always in favour of kind of, as much immigration as possible." And we sort of talked a bit further, and he came out with what I thought was an absolutely astonishing thing to say, particularly if you're head of the National Civil Service, which is that, I believe in maximising global welfare, not national welfare. And I happen to be sitting that the man to my left these were probably the two most powerful unelected people in Britain at the time. Gus O'Donnell, and to my left was Mark Thompson, who was then head of the BBC. And I said to Mark, "Did you just hear that? The head of the National Civil Service just said that he thought it was his job to maximise global welfare." And Mark Thompson said, "Oh, well, I agree with him, of course." That sort of, I think, was one of the kind of inspirations for writing both of my books, actually, in a way.
But the issue you have now in our society now is if you make jokes about Boris Johnson or Theresa May, it's very easy. But as someone who's from a Jewish background, talking about anti-Semitism and Labour, people don't react in the same way at all, even though the allegations are equally serious and equally legitimate, as we now know.
How do they react then?
Very much like you're talking about a very sacred figure. If you make fun of or make jokes about Jeremy Corbyn, the reaction seems to be like this person shouldn't be laughed at very often. So I think there's a bit of a double standard there, which troubles me in comedy, but it troubles me more broadly in society. We don't treat the two sides of the political spectrum in anything like the same way.
You mentioned there at the beginning that you're drawing on what happened last year. I mean, just to people I'm sure are very familiar with it, but you were asked to sign some form, and there's a list of all the things they were asking you not to be.
Yes,
it went on and on, didn't it? What was it now?
So they said that they have a zero tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, and anti-atheism. So you're asking me how to do comedy, you're laughing already, right? And it also, by the way, said that all jokes must be respectful and kind, which, I don't know. I mean, it's a comedy show. It's not the Green Party conference where someone's going to burst into tears because the falafel wrap's not 100% vegan. Do you know? It's it's insanity. And of course, if it had just been that incident, I don't think I would have made any big deal out of it. But I think, as you and I both know, we are now living in a society where institutions like universities, they're no longer about learning. They're about indoctrination. They're about spreading a particular ideology among young people.